Montana Territory, 1879. The eastern sky blushed pink as dawn crept across the Gallatin Valley, painting the distant mountains in purple shadow. Zane Turner tightened the cinch on his saddle, his movements practiced and efficient. At 25, he'd already spent more years in the saddle than many men twice his age, working cattle across 3 territories since he was 14. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sage and prairie grass, a smell that meant both home and homeless to him. Heading out early again, Turner? The ranch foreman called from the cookhouse door. Zane nodded without looking up. Fence line needs checking on the north pasture. Figured I'd get it done before the heat. Truth was, he preferred the solitude of dawn patrols. 6 months at the Rockingham Ranch was the longest he'd stayed anywhere since leaving Missouri. Something about putting down roots made him restless, like wearing a shirt too small across the shoulders. The frontier was no place for permanent attachments. Men who thought otherwise ended up with graves on lonely hillsides and widows heading back east. He swung into the saddle, his lean frame moving with the easy grace of someone who belonged on horseback. Handsome in a weathered way, with eyes the color of summer sky and light stubble darkening his jaw, Zane could have had his pick of the young women at the town socials. But he never went, despite the foreman's persistent invitations. "You can't ride the fence line forever, boy," the old man had told him once. Man needs more than just his horse and his thoughts. Zane had just smiled that tight smile of his that never reached his eyes. What he needed was exactly what he had: open country, good work, and the freedom to move on when the walls started closing in. Love and family were luxuries that got men killed in a land where winter storms, rustlers, and a dozen other dangers waited to test your mettle. He'd seen it happen too many times. His sorrel gelding picked its way down to the creek that marked the northern boundary of the ranch. The morning light spilled across the valley like honey, turning the dew-laden grass to gold. It was the kind of beauty that sometimes made his chest ache with something he couldn't name. Something like longing, but for what, he couldn't say. The sound reached him before he saw her. Soft, broken sobs that seemed to rise from the creek itself. Zane reined in, listening. A coyote? No. The crying was too human, too full of heartache. He dismounted quietly, looping the reins around a cottonwood branch, and moved cautiously toward the sound. That's when he saw her. She sat on a flat rock beside the creek, her dark blue skirts spread around her like a pool of midnight water. Her head was bowed, hands covering her face, shoulders shaking with each sob. Long blonde hair fell in loose waves down her back, catching the sunrise in strands of gold. She looked small against the vastness of the Montana landscape, vulnerable in a way that made something protective stir in Zane's chest. He should leave. This was private grief, not meant for strangers' eyes. But even as he thought it, his boot dislodged a stone that clattered down the bank. She startled, head snapping up, revealing a face that stole the breath from his lungs. She was young, no more than 20, he guessed, with clear blue eyes now rimmed red from crying and cheeks flushed with emotion. Despite her tear-streaked face, she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the careful artifice of town girls. This was the beauty of wildflowers that somehow survived prairie winters. "I'm sorry," he said, removing his hat. "I didn't mean to disturb you, ma'am." She hastily wiped her cheeks. "This is Rockingham land. Are you with the ranch?" Her voice carried the faintest hint of an Eastern accent, softened by what sounded like years in the West. "Yes, ma'am. Zane Turner. I ride for Mr. Miller." She stood, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "I'm Zara Taylor. My father purchased the Peterson place last month." She gestured vaguely eastward. "We're neighbors, I suppose." Zane nodded. The Peterson homestead had sat empty since the old man died last winter. He'd heard someone had bought it, but hadn't paid much attention to the gossip. An awkward silence stretched between them. Her eyes, the color of cornflowers, kept darting to the creek and back, as if whatever had brought her to tears might still be visible in the rushing water. "Are you all right, Miss Taylor?" he finally asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Is there trouble at your place?" She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "Not trouble exactly. Just—" She looked away. "It's nothing. I shouldn't be bothering you with my foolishness." Another woman might have tried to hide her tears completely, to maintain the pretense that nothing was wrong. But she stood there with dignity despite her obvious distress. making no excuses. It stirred something in him he thought he'd buried long ago. Before he could think better of it, Zane stepped closer. I don't mean to pry, but sitting alone crying by a creek at dawn doesn't seem like nothing. To his surprise, she let out a small, watery laugh. No, I suppose it doesn't. She looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Have you ever felt completely alone, Mr. Turner? Even when surrounded by people? The question hit closer to home than she could know. Yes, ma'am, he answered simply. I reckon I have. Today would have been my mother's birthday, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She died last year. Consumption. She turned back toward the creek. This place reminded me of where she used to take me fishing when I was a girl, back in Pennsylvania. I thought I was ready to face the day, but her voice broke, and without thinking, Zane reached into his pocket for the clean bandana he kept there. He held it out to her. Sometimes memories hit harder than a physical blow, he said. She took the bandana, her fingers brushing his. Thank you. As she dabbed at her eyes, Zane surprised himself by saying, Let me be the one who dries your tears, Miss Taylor. The words hung in the air between them, more intimate than he'd intended. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. It was a thought that had formed unbidden in his mind. Yet there it was. Her eyes widened slightly, a flush creeping across her cheeks. For a moment, he thought he'd overstepped badly. Then something softened in her expression. That's a kind offer from a stranger, Mr. Turner, she said finally. Not strangers, he corrected gently. Neighbors. A hint of a smile touched her lips. Neighbors, then. The rising sun cast long shadows across the creek bank. The day was beginning in earnest, and they both had responsibilities waiting. Can I escort you home, Miss Taylor? These hills can be tricky if you don't know them well. She seemed about to refuse, then nodded. I'd appreciate that. My father will be wondering where I've gone. He helped her onto his horse, then led it by the reins toward the Peterson place. With each step, Zane felt something shift inside him, like ground giving way beneath his feet. This woman's grief had somehow pierced the careful armor he'd built around himself. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. As the Peterson homestead came into view, a modest cabin with a new barn behind it and freshly turned earth where a garden was being established, Zane saw a tall man exit the cabin, his face creased with worry. He straightened when he spotted them. That's my father, Zara said. He's been trying to make this place habitable since we arrived. It needs a lot of work. When they reached the yard, her father strode toward them, relief evident in his features. Zara, I was about to come looking for you. I'm sorry to worry you, father. I went for an early walk and lost track of time. Mr. Turner was kind enough to escort me home. Zane tipped his hat as Zara slid from the horse with practiced ease. Zane Turner, sir. I ride for the Rockingham. Thomas Taylor, the older man replied, shaking Zane's hand firmly. Appreciate you seeing my daughter safely home. There was something in the man's eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Zane recognized it as the same hollow look he sometimes caught in his own reflection. Loss had marked them both. You've got quite a task ahead, getting this place running again, Zane observed, looking around at the half-finished repairs. Taylor nodded grimly. More than I bargained for, truth be told. Peterson let things go these past few years. An idea formed in Zane's mind. I have Sundays free. I could lend a hand, if you'd be amenable. The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise the Taylors. He wasn't one to volunteer for extra work, especially not for strangers. But something about the determination in Zara's eyes and the quiet dignity with which she carried her grief pulled at him. That's mighty generous, Thomas said slowly. But we couldn't impose. It's no imposition, Zane interrupted. Being neighborly is how folks survive out here. He caught Zara's gaze, saw something like hope flicker there. It was enough to make him certain he'd return, even as a voice in his head warned him against forming attachments. Sunday, then, Thomas agreed. We'd be grateful for the help. As Zane mounted his horse to leave, Zara stepped forward. Mr. Turner, she called softly. Your bandana. She held it out, now neatly folded despite the tear stains. He shook his head. Keep it. Might still be some tears that need drying. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Then he tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward the ranch, aware that the day had somehow shifted the course of his carefully ordered life. Sunday came both too quickly and not quickly enough. Zane arrived at the Taylor homestead just after dawn, telling himself his eagerness was about the work and nothing more. But when Zara appeared on the porch, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid and wearing a practical work dress of faded blue cotton, he knew he was lying to himself. "You came," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I said I would." He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. Thomas emerged from the barn, tools in hand. "Turner, good to see you made it." The day passed in hard, honest work, repairing the cabin roof, mending fences, and clearing the choked irrigation ditch that ran from the creek to their fields. Zara worked alongside them, her strength and determination belying her slender frame. She wasn't afraid of dirt or sweat, and more than once, Zane caught himself watching her longer than was proper. When noon came, she called them to a simple meal of biscuits, cold ham, and coffee. As they ate in the shade of a cottonwood, conversation flowed more easily than Zane expected. "What brought you to Montana?" he asked. "It's a long way from Pennsylvania." Thomas and Zara exchanged a glance laden with unspoken meaning. "After my wife passed," Thomas said slowly, "there wasn't much keeping us in Harrisburg. I'd been a carpenter there, but work dried up when the panic hit. Then when Catherine died," he trailed off. "Father thought a fresh start would help," Zara continued. "And land is affordable here." "Affordable because it tries to kill you 6 months out of the year," Zane said with a wry smile. Thomas laughed, a rusty sound as if long and used. "We've been warned about the winters." "You'll need more provisions than you think," Zane advised. "First snow can come as early as September in these parts. And your roof needs more work than we can finish today." "We'll manage," Thomas said, though uncertainty shadowed his eyes. "Father's been unwell," Zara said quietly. "The journey was harder on him than he'll admit." Thomas shot her a warning look, but she met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Turner is offering help. We can't afford pride." The honesty in her words struck Zane. Most settlers would rather starve than admit weakness. This straightforward acknowledgement of vulnerability was rare and dangerous in its own way. The frontier devoured the weak. "I'll come back next Sunday," Zane found himself saying. "And maybe I can spare a few evenings this week." "We can't pay you," Thomas said bluntly. "I'm not asking for payment." Zane's eyes drifted to Zara before he could stop himself. Just being neighborly. That evening, as Zane prepared to leave, Zara walked him to his horse. "Why are you really helping us, Mr. Turner?" she asked, her gaze direct. The question caught him off guard. "Like I said, neighbors." "Please don't," she interrupted gently. "I've had enough platitudes from well-meaning folks to last a lifetime. If it's pity, I'd rather know." Her forthrightness was both refreshing and unsettling. Zane considered his words carefully. "When I found you by the creek," he finally said, "you reminded me of something I've been trying to forget." "What's that?" "That grief means you had something worth losing." He adjusted his saddle strap, avoiding her eyes. "Some folks never have that much." She was silent for so long that he finally looked up. The understanding in her eyes made his chest tighten. "Sunday, then," she said simply. He nodded. "Sunday." Over the next weeks, Zane found himself at the Taylor homestead whenever he could be spared from the rocking M. The foreman gave him knowing looks but said nothing beyond. "About time you found something besides cattle to occupy your mind." July melted into August, and with each visit, Zane felt the careful distance he maintained from others diminishing. He learned that Zara was 20 years old, that she could recite Tennyson from memory, that she'd taught school briefly in Pennsylvania. He discovered her quiet strength as she tended her ailing father, whose cough grew worse despite the summer warmth. In turn, he found himself sharing pieces of his own past, his childhood in Missouri, losing his parents to fever when he was 12, the years riding with cattle drives across the territories. He never spoke of these things to others, yet with Zara, the words came easily. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Thomas having already retired for the night, Zara asked the question he'd been dreading. "Why do you never speak of settling down, Zane? A man doesn't usually drift for 10 years without reason." He stared at the distant peaks, considering deflection, then decided on truth. "I rode with a man once, Marcus Whalen. Best cowhand I ever knew. He saved enough to buy a small spread in Wyoming, married a woman he'd been writing to for years. I stood witness at their wedding." He paused, the memory still sharp. 8 months later, I helped bury them both. Rustlers hit their place while I was passing through. Marcus tried to defend what was his. Zara's hand found his on the porch railing, her touch light but steady. I'm sorry. I've seen it happen too many times. Men put down roots, start believing in futures, and the frontier takes it all away. Love is a luxury out here, and a dangerous one. So you decided never to risk it? Her voice held no judgment, only curiosity. Seemed the sensible choice. Can't lose what you never have. She was quiet for a long moment. That sounds like a different kind of death, Zane. Slower, perhaps, but still death. Her words stayed with him as he rode back to the ranch under a sky ablaze with stars. They troubled him because he knew they contained a truth he'd been avoiding. September brought the first hints of autumn, aspen leaves turning gold on the mountainsides. The work at the Taylor's place progressed, roof mended, barn secured, winter would stacked high. But Thomas grew weaker, his cough deeper, his skin taking on the same gray pallor Zane remembered from his mother's final days. One Sunday, Zane arrived to find Zara alone, splitting kindling with fierce, mechanical strokes. "Pa's having a bad day," she said when she saw him, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Doctor from town came yesterday. Says it's his lungs." Zane took the axe from her hands. "Zara, he wants to speak with you." She wouldn't meet his eyes. "He's on the porch. I need to finish this." He understood. Work kept the fear at bay, gave purpose when everything else seemed to be crumbling. He handed back the axe and walked to the porch, where Thomas sat wrapped in blankets despite the mild day. "Turner." Thomas greeted him, his voice a rasp. "Good of you to come." Zane sat beside him. "How bad is it?" Thomas appreciated directness. "Bad enough. Doc gives me till winter, if I'm lucky." The blunt assessment hung in the air between them. Zane had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach knot. "Zara doesn't know the timeline," Thomas continued. "Doc told me private-like." He coughed, a wet, tearing sound. "I'm not afraid of dying. Done my share of living." "But Zara," his weathered face creased with worry. "What becomes of her?" Zane stared across the small homestead they'd worked so hard to make viable. "She could sell the place, go back east where she has family." Thomas shook his head. "No family left who'd take her in. Her mother's people never approved of me." He fixed Zane with a piercing gaze. "I've seen how you look at her, and how she looks at you when she thinks no one notices." Heat crept up Zane's neck. "Mr. Taylor, I'm not asking for promises. God knows you've done more for us than we had any right to expect. Just," he paused, struggling for breath. "Just don't disappear on her when I go. Give her time to find her footing. She's stronger than she looks, but even the strong need a friend sometimes." "You have my word," Zane said, knowing even as he spoke that he was committing to something that went against every instinct he'd developed over the past decade. The thought of watching Zara face another devastating loss made his chest ache. When he left that evening, Zara walked him to his horse as had become their custom. "What did he say to you?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her fear. Zane considered lying, offering platitudes about her father's health improving. But she deserved better than that. "He's worried about you," he said simply. "About what happens after." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the darkening mountains. "So am I." She looked up at him then, her blue eyes clear and direct. "Will you still come around when he's gone?" The question pierced him, and it was everything he'd been avoiding: commitment, attachment, the possibility of loss. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I'll be here, Zara." Something shifted in her expression, relief, perhaps, or hope. "Thank you." Impulsively, he reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was brief, barely there, yet it sent awareness coursing through him like lightning. "I should go," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She stepped back, but her eyes held his. Sunday, he confirmed. The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountains in late September. Thomas grew weaker with each passing day. The ranch foreman, seeing Zane's distraction, reassigned him to duties closer to the Taylor homestead, a kindness Zane never acknowledged but deeply appreciated. October brought both beauty and dread, golden aspen against cobalt skies, and the knowledge that Thomas was slipping away. Zane spent every free moment at the homestead now, handling the heavier chores and sitting with Thomas in the evenings. It was during one such evening, as Zara prepared dinner and Zane sat whittling by Thomas's bedside, that the older man gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll look after her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Zane set down his knife. "I've already given you my word I'll stay around." Thomas shook his head weakly. "Not what I'm asking." His eyes, though clouded with pain, held Zane's. "I'm asking if you love her enough to give up running." The question stole Zane's breath. Love. He'd been carefully avoiding the word, even in his own thoughts. But faced with Thomas's direct question, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. "Yes," he admitted, the word feeling like surrender and victory all at once. "But I don't know if she does," Thomas interrupted. "Has since you found her at that creek." Too much her mother's daughter to say it first, though. Before Zane could respond, Zara entered with a tray of broth and bread. The conversation ended, but Thomas's words echoed in Zane's mind long into the night. The first serious snowfall came 3 days later, blanking the valley in white silence. Zane rode through it to the Taylor homestead, worry gnawing at him. He found Zara on her knees beside her father's bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Thomas Taylor had passed in the night. The next days passed in a blur of necessary tasks. Zane rode to town for the undertaker, helped dig the grave on the small rise behind the cabin where the view stretched all the way to the mountains. The service was small, just Zane, Zara, the preacher, and a few neighbors who'd come to know the Taylors over the summer. Through it all, Zara moved with quiet dignity, her grief contained but visible in the shadows beneath her eyes and the tightness around her mouth. She accepted condolences with grace, arranged everything with practical efficiency, and never once broke down in public. It wasn't until everyone had gone, leaving them alone in the cabin that had become so familiar to Zane, that her composure finally cracked. "I don't know what to do now," she said, her voice small in the silent room. "I always knew this was coming, but now that it's here." Zane crossed to her, hesitating only briefly before taking her hands in his. "You don't have to decide anything tonight. I can't run this place alone," she said, the practical problem easier to face than the emotional void. "Even with your help, it's too much for one person. You could sell," he suggested carefully. "Use the money to start fresh somewhere else." Her eyes met his, filled with questions she couldn't voice. "Where would I go?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Zane knew his next words would irrevocably change the course of both their lives. "You could marry me," he said quietly. Her eyes widened. "Zane, I know the timing is terrible," he rushed on. "And this isn't how I wanted to ask, but I've been thinking about it for weeks now." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Zara. I think I have since I found you crying by that creek." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Is this because you promised my father you'd look after me?" The question stung, but he answered honestly. "I did promise him, but that's not why I'm asking." He released her hands and stepped back, giving her space. "I'm asking because the thought of not seeing you every day makes it hard to breathe. Because you've made me question everything I believed about what's possible out here." Tears filled her eyes, but these were different from the grief-stricken sobs he'd witnessed before. "I thought you'd leave," she whispered. "Once he was gone. I thought that was the frontier way. Everyone leaves eventually." "I'm done leaving," Zane said, the truth of it settling in his bones. "If you'll have me." She moved toward him then, closing the distance he'd created. "Ask me properly, Zane Turner." A smile touched his lips as he dropped to one knee before her, taking her hand in his. "Zara Taylor, will you marry me? Not because you need someone to help run this homestead, or because I promised your father, but because I love you and want to build a life with you." "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will." When he stood and gathered her in his arms, the kiss they shared felt like coming home after years of wandering. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with the ranch foreman and his wife as witnesses. Winter settled over the valley, deep snow isolating homesteads and ranches for weeks at a time. But inside their cabin, warmth prevailed. As they sat before the fire on Christmas Eve, Zara's head resting against his shoulder, Zane reflected on the journey that had brought him here. All those years of keeping his distance, of believing that love was a luxury too dangerous to afford on the frontier, seemed like a different life now. "What are you thinking about?" Zara asked, looking up at him. "About how wrong I was," he replied, his arm tightening around her. I thought caring for someone out here was a weakness that would get you killed. But it's the opposite. She smiled, understanding in her eyes. It's what keeps you alive. Yes, he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Exactly that. Outside, the Montana winter raged, harsh and unforgiving as it had always been. But within the walls they'd built together, both physical and emotional, they'd found a shelter strong enough to withstand any storm. The frontier hadn't changed. It was still dangerous, unpredictable, capable of taking everything in an instant. But Zane had changed. He'd learned that love wasn't a luxury to be avoided, but the very thing that made survival meaningful. As the firelight played across Zara's face, Zane remembered that moment by the creek months ago. Her tears, his impulsive offer, the connection that had sparked between them. He'd been right to offer comfort to a crying stranger, wrong to believe that keeping his heart walled off was the only way to survive the West. Spring would come again. Their land would need tending, cattle would need moving, the work would never end. But they would face it together, and in that joining of hands and hearts, Zane Turner had finally found the home he'd been running from all along.